This week we want to chat through a couple interesting things. Personally, I want to talk about Coingecko and CoinMarketCap, some of the biggest websites in the space and the role that they have in the industry. How about you, Charlie?
I want to talk about wallets and sort of like, I think that they're a little bit, it took me a long time to wrap my head around wallets, the fact that different networks have different wallets and what wallets mean when it comes to self-custody versus using a centralized player like Coinbase, which we've spoken about. So taking a higher level view of wallets, I think.
Shit, what is the last third thing I was going to just talk about?
Bonus. Yeah, dude, you got some bonus content potentially.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. We'll cut that last part.
You're good.
If we have time at the end, we'll go through some like news, some happenings in the space that I know Charlie didn't hear about. And then definitely we're doing hot takes this week. Definitely. But let's get straight into it. I'm going to put, if you're watching this on video, I'll post the tweet up on the video. If you're not and you're listening via podcast app, this is a tweet from Coingecko last week that is pretty much, it just says the top 10 gainers in the last 24 hours. And it shows their token tickers. It's got, 31,000 views. But I wanted to kind of zoom in a little bit because there's two main players in the space where you like look up a price, like Bitcoin price. If you Google it, you're gonna get CoinMarketCap and CoinGecko are gonna be the top two sites that come up, and they pretty much index the price of all tokens at all times. They both get respectively in December 2022, CoinGecko got 30 million site visits and CoinMarketCap had 89 million site visits. So we're talking about in the crypto space, people who operate on chain are probably less than 1 million, and they are just doing an insane amount of volume of people coming to these sites. So one of the things that interests me is how they have like some of the biggest media power in all of crypto. And what they really promote is just people looking for things that are gaining a lot of price. And it seems to me like a pretty lost opportunity to educate people in the space. One thing we talk about a lot is that like there's so many scams out there, people just promoting tokens that have no value. That's one of the reasons a lot of people consider the space a scam. I mean, FTX was recent and they had their own FTT token that turned out to just be a facade that they were leveraging against. And people look for tokens like that they can make a bunch of money on. And these two news sources are pretty much taking that narrative and like cranking it up to 11. If you go to their homepage, it's all about top gainers, top losers, top market cap tokens. Do you use CoinMarketCap or CoinGecko at all?
I mean, when I'm talking to protocols, just through working in DeFi, when I speak to protocols and I'm doing some research before a call in the same way that when I worked in software, I would use Crunchbase to look at companies and look at their funding, looking at the team on LinkedIn, those sorts of things. CoinMarketCap is sort of, and also CoinGecko, definitely interchangeable. They're both, it helps me to understand a little bit more about how they present themselves. Like they oftentimes have summaries too. Like if I think that it's an option for you to add a summary, have links to your Twitter, links to your website. And ultimately there's a lot of scams. You can just search in Google some protocol that's really small. And so it helps me to make sure that I'm looking at the right stuff and clicking on the right links. So it's like I use it as like an aggregator, but I don't really like hang out on the homepage, for example.
Yeah. It's got, as far as information goes, they do a really good job of trying to pull everything that you would need as far as like the amount of tokens. So like the total supply for a token, there's a lot of tokens that have what are called emissions. So that means that smart contracts will send out a certain amount of that token over a set period of time. So you could have a very long emission schedule, which means you eventually have 1 billion of a token. But right now there might only be 10 million in circulating supply. So being able to track stuff like that, super helpful. It's good to have a source of truth for price, definitely. I think one of the interesting things for me is that they both have a lot of weight in changing people's minds, because you have, tens of millions of people potentially coming to your site a day. And when it's only really focused on price and a lot of the content that they push out on Twitter, which is it's the biggest platform for anybody who's in the space. they're pretty much just cranking out like, what's your favorite token? Here's the biggest gainers. Here's the biggest losers. Getting people's thoughts on that. And CoinMarketCap got acquired by Binance a few years ago. I don't know if you know that.
Oh, I didn't even know that. I didn't know that. That's so interesting.
Yeah, it was supposedly like a straight up venture acquisition, but there is they claim that they're completely separate and that they don't have the same decisioning boards. Yeah, but CoinMarketCap is releasing their own social platform within their site. So for each, there's like feeds almost like Twitter. It's pretty rudimentary. I've been playing around with it the past 7 months, and for the project I work for, I've gotten over 14,000 followers just very organically without having to do a lot.
Damn.
So yeah, I do see it as being a place where people can go for information and a place where people who put out good information can shine. And maybe Crypto Blue Hour will do that at some point, have our own profile on CoinMarketCap and try and put out information that actually serves a purpose rather than trying to get people to pump and dump stuff. But
that's so interesting. So you think of it as like social media that's native to crypto, I guess, sort of.
Yeah, I think it could be. I think that to me, Coingecko doesn't have this, and Coingecko is much more just facts and figures. But CoinMarketCap has their own blog section, their own semi-community feed, which is a Twitter feed, basically, where you can post photos, you can tag projects with their ticker, you can link out. So I see it as being an interesting opportunity, especially for people who are in the space. If they want to get in front of people, now it's a pretty rudimentary platform, but if it grows, if they actually add stuff like video or sound or spaces, podcasts would be cool. And I think they could see themselves doing that if they get a lot of traction.
I didn't know that they were owned by Binance. That's a little bit of like what if they ultimately make a design decision later that it's going to default to Binance Smart Chain, which is a network that's a fork of Ethereum ultimately. And so, it's interesting when it's owned by such a massive player. It is, we just have such a weird taste in our mouths from the last 9 months or so, 10 months, when we saw Terra Luna crash in May. And then we've just seen the FTX, very famous, sort of very different problems. One, FTX was ultimately just a classic old school fraud. Crypto wasn't unique in any way to their whole Ponzi scheme or their fraud. It wasn't a Ponzi scheme. It was a straight up fraud.
Straight up fraud, yeah.
Yeah. But that's so interesting. Yeah, I don't play around with them very often. It's cool. I didn't know that about CoinMarketCap quite so much.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thing, and maybe something we'll touch on more and more. But the way that people talk about the space, it's fascinating to me. And I don't think you should, if you're learning about Bitcoin or Ethereum, the first thing you shouldn't be worried as much about the price as what's the future of this tech. So if you're using those, maybe dig a little deeper before making any buying decisions. Don't just go check the price, hit buy and buy it. Dig a little deeper.
Yeah. It really sucks how so much of the available information is specific to DeFi, which is, that's absolutely fine in and of itself. That's where most of the builders seem to be, at least the people who are very like blockchain, distributed ledger stuff. And they're like in your face about it. They mostly work in decentralized finance. But it's a little bit frustrating that most of these websites that are so popular, including apps like Coinbase, which is a centralized exchange, the main screen is like the top movers for the day. And I don't give a shit about what is happening with with like all these tokens. I don't know any of these tokens. It's very confusing.
Yeah, it is. And it's like, it leans towards people who are day trading or investing rather than people who are interested in the actual tech, which is something that I believe we harp on a lot, and we will continue that. There's a lot, once you dig deeper and stop worrying about price, there is a wide range of things that can be done with this tech, that will be done with this tech. You can find projects, and if you're interested in investing, you can definitely invest over time. But if you change your mindset from, I need to make as much money as I can on this investment, to I should learn about the tech and what actually has value and can be built on, that will serve you way better in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's sort of, the most interesting part is sort of thinking about it as analogous to the internet to me. And I think, there are internet companies that did very well, and some of them did very not as well. And so, you can think about it as these speculative investments if that's what you're so inclined to do, but that's not really my instinct. I'm not like a financier who sits around and thinks about numbers all day, you know.
Yeah,
and that's why it's weird to me.
Like,
yeah, I know, yeah, definitely. You know, like, I think ultimately, like, my mom downloads the Coinbase app, she's playing around with it, and she's being immediately shown the top movers, and that's very sort of like, it's almost like going into a casino, and they're like luring you in, you know, and they're like pumping oxygen into the room to make you feel as though it's like, it's very weird. Like, so I just feel like it's very sort of, no, I'm with you. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty much all I have as far as my high horse on CoinGecko and CoinMarketCap. Tread lightly, get into it, be cognizant of it, and stop looking at price so much.
Yeah, seriously. So like, to take us, we were just talking a moment ago, you had mentioned how there are things outside of decentralized finance that people are working on. And, you know, I was speaking with somebody recently, they had asked me, like, sort of, like, what else is there? You know, and I was like, well, there's a lot going on. Like, what? And I was like, okay, well,
yeah,
like,
what is going on?
A recent example is, you know, in December through January, there started to be a very large uptick in transactions on one of the many networks that exist, one of these distributed ledger networks called Hedera specifically. You actually happen to be wearing the hat, which is funny.
Guilty as charged, dude.
Yeah, but on Hedera, they have an interesting model where they have a governing council of very large organizations, so multinational Fortune 500 companies that you would know. This week, yesterday, they announced Dell is their newest member to that council, for example. But they also have Boeing and Google and other very large organizations, top universities, you know, all these random things. And they're across 6 continents. They have many, like 20 plus countries covered. And so the idea is that it's decentralized through a governing council of very reputable organizations, instead of just through like a decentralized autonomous organization that's anonymous folks who then are trying to organize one another, which is very difficult without a central governing body. And I think anybody who doesn't,
and then you figure out one of the guys went to jail or something. It's like,
yeah,
you're like, oh,
exactly,
yeah,
which happens a lot. Corrupt. Fascinating. Yeah, these dudes are shady. Yes, like Sifu and stuff. Gosh, it's fascinating.
Remember those who aren't aware, that was crazy. If you can be anonymous, a lot of people who have been predatory in the past will flock to those places because they can get away without their reputation being out there. So it is very cool. I like that about Hedera, that they kind of launch with a lot of institutional council members who give a degree of credibility to what they're doing. A lot of people are what we would call decentralized maxis, who believe that everything should be as owned by a large distribution of people as possible. Kind of don't like that about them, but their game plan, and I've listened to a lot, is that they want to be around for 100 years or more, like longer than 100 years. And they're doing a slow rollout of the way that they build their network by using these large institutions to give credibility and shake out some of those things that people harp on crypto about for being a scam, which is, you know, anonymous people, anonymous players. These are very credible people who have attached their name to Hedera, which is cool.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And so this governing council, they publish minutes on a quarterly basis. And so it's interesting to keep up with what it is that they're working on. But ultimately, a lot of these companies are not finance companies, they're logistic companies. And so they have different processes that they can make more efficient. Since they're already using databases, whether it's a NoSQL data, you know, there are all sorts of different databases. And then there are software companies that do their entire business model is around database construction, database management, and leveraging the data that's within those databases. MongoDB comes to mind. I know a lot of people who work there. It's a very large organization based in New York City, and they're publicly traded. But nonetheless, Hedera, as this example, they in December to January they had this very large uptick in transactions, and no one really understood why. And what was actually happening is since been confirmed that we had Atma.io, which is a subsidiary of a very large organization, Avery Dennison, that is doing supply chain logistics on chain, meaning that they're able to track these things very, very quickly, with certainty that things are happening in a very traceable way. And so that allows for the end consumer to be able to scan a QR code on the back of a product and see, okay, this was in this hand and this was created there, and there's all these validation steps, and that's a big part of sort of the lineage of any sort of product potentially, and that gets a lot of people excited. And then also the supply chain logistics part of it is when there are things or inefficiencies, they can ultimately look back at that and potentially fill the gaps. So they were doing a lot of testing and ultimately sort of blowing these numbers out of the water that people are so used to talking about on other networks that are, there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's thrown at all these networks in terms of their throughput capacity, whether or not their actually uptime is solid and they're going to be able to run and have these large number of transactions with, and be scalable at an enterprise level, so to speak. And so, be software that can be used by enterprises. And very quietly, Hedera has been around for a while. That happened very quietly. Atma.io didn't even really say anything about it until a couple of weeks ago in Davos. They had the World Economic Forum was there, and somebody from Avery Dennison, specifically from Atma.io, was talking about it. And it's very interesting, how they're thinking about it. They're not blockchain people. They're not distributed ledger people. They're not even speaking about Hedera. And that's the whole idea that we're kind of driving home here. So it doesn't matter what's going on under the hood, to use that analogy from a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was. It's the fact that it's just more efficient and it's just working more consistently. Hedera also, when it comes to these businesses, a big reason that businesses are adverse to using some sort of distributed ledger tech is because the costs are variable. With CoinMarketCap or Coingecko, when you're seeing these price movements, oftentimes those tokens, I don't think of them as being valued. I don't buy ETH and sit, and I know that's not everybody's opinion, and you can do it, you make your own decisions, but ultimately I don't think of it as anything other than a gas token. So it allows me to transact on the Ethereum blockchain. And so I have to get ETH from time to time, but it's begrudgingly. I don't like to do it. And those prices are variable. So I'll buy a small amount of ETH for gas, and that gas will allow me to do transactions when I have to bridge between different networks, and that's ultimately the middleman oftentimes, just because it's the largest. But all that is to say that with Hedera, they've made it such that these organizations can have very predictable business costs. So transactions on the blockchain for Hedera, specifically when you're doing these making those sorts of token calls, and those transactions are the exact same flat fee every single time, which is a fraction of a cent. And so it allows for them to predict months and years in advance, not that they ever would, but it allows for somebody to do financial modeling a year out. That is very predictable in terms of their costs for maintaining this information, and that's unique to that. They're not all distributed ledgers are focused on that enterprise use case, which is interesting.
I think people who are on chain, which means interacting on the blockchain, making swaps, buying things, realize on an Ethereum or an Avalanche or any of these what are called layer twos, which are roll-ups in Ethereum. It depends on how many people are using the network at a time, how much it costs to do anything, the tax for making a transaction. But on Hedera, the fact that it's a fixed fee model is very attractive to people who have a lot of money, and it's a very cool use case and I really like what you said about buying these because you have to do transactions. That's the best reason to buy ETH or AVAX in those scenarios. If you're going to go do something on that chain, you buy it to do that. You don't buy it because you're like, oh, it's down to $18 today. I think it's going to be $20 in 2 weeks. Buy it because you're going to go do something on that chain,
Exactly. Yeah. I think so. Then that kind of relates back to what it is that I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to sort of plug that there are other examples of organizations that are using distributed technology outside of, but outside of anything that's decentralized finance at all. And they're not tokenizing things, for example. They're just using this as a sort of an evolution in sort of the database software product that already exists. They're using this as a in some instances there is efficiency gains in using distributed ledger tech for some things that need to be don't need to be, but can be more transparent, and that is ultimately a net gain for the business and the consumer potentially. And there are other examples, but I don't necessarily want to focus too much on that because I wanted to take the only thing I wanted to talk about today is really taking a higher level look at what's a wallet, right? So like when you go into Coinbase, for example, like I'm in New York, and so we have the BIT license here very famously, and the BIT license is very restrictive of organizations that want to spin up the availability for crypto for end users. We're the financial center of the world. Don't quote me on that. I'm not exactly sure how accurate that might be, but ultimately there's a lot of heavy-handedness when it comes to the regulation around crypto in New York State. And that's good and bad. FTX, anybody who lives in New York State, they can't use FTX. They couldn't use FTX. And so that massive collapse that had happened, no one who I hang out with here and uses or is based in New York could use FTX. And so there wasn't a lot of pain and suffering in that regard, as opposed to somebody who might have been in any one of a number of different states. But Coinbase, you think of them as like sort of an intermediary, right? So you have, your bank account with Chase or any one of those massive organizations that all own each other. those organizations, those banks, if you want to actually get crypto, there are lots of options to do so. Peer-to-peer is one of the most sort of like original ways to do it. You have to trust somebody, and it's not always the easiest thing to find a marketplace that you can do that on. If you wanted to do it in person, what are you going to do? You're going to do it with cash? Are you going to Venmo? Like, logistically, it's not that clean of a process. So when it comes to people who do have access to banking infrastructure and have an account at Chase or Citibank or something like that, the ability to transfer that money into a Coinbase, which is a centralized exchange, and that's really what they market themselves as. Coinbase is really the leader in the space right now. There are other options. Kraken is one of them. I'm in New York. They don't comply to the bit license. So I can't use them. But Coinbase is a publicly traded company that's very, very reputable. I really like the way that Brian Armstrong approached the FTX debacle, the fraud, and I think he was very eloquent about his discussion of it the day of.
He's an awesome voice in the space, dude.
I agree.
He was. They originally created Coinbase as a Bitcoin wallet because they wanted a wallet option, and they discovered through that people were really just looking for a place to buy Bitcoin. Everybody was like, how can I buy Bitcoin? I know I have this wallet. And so they started working on that solution. And he's been a big proponent of, yes, this is centralized, but this isn't the end game for crypto. The end game for crypto.
The whole point. Exactly. And that's the whole thing, is that it's not, Coinbase is not really a wallet. It's a fiat on-ramp is how I would describe it. So it allows for you to take your fiat that exists in an existing bank account. And so we're not talking about a lot of the disruption and sort of the availability of financial infrastructure for people who don't have it. That's not the specific, that's not the sort of context I want to frame this with here. Much more interested in, I have a bank account. I'd like to make transactions on Ethereum. I'd like to play with NFTs. I'd like to do something and just kind of play around, get my hands dirty, and just kind of, take $100 and make some transactions and see what's going on, see what people are building. You don't necessarily need to actually buy these tokens in order to see what people are building necessarily, but there are a lot of games that allow for you, in the same way that you need to buy the CD-ROM when we were kids and plug it into your computer and download the game. It's somewhat similar in some of the game instances on the blockchain. So you might need the tokens to actually play, but all that is. So you go to Coinbase, and it allows for you to transfer that money in from your bank account, and then from there you can go ahead and make transactions. And I know that you dollar cost average oftentimes, once a week or whatever it is, and you've been doing that for a very long time.
Dude, I do it every day now.
Every day, cool, yeah. So ultimately, what you're doing then is it's custodied by Coinbase, and that's what you mean when you had said a moment ago it's centralized. And so Brian Armstrong, the founder and the CEO there, he understands that that's against the ethos of Bitcoin, for example, but that's not the problem he's solving for. He's not there for people who are decentralized maxis, right? He's there for people who need to on-ramp with their fiat, which is an incredibly powerful tool that allows people to interact with this technology without having to be a real super user of the internet. And without a peer-to-peer network of people that they can actually transact with in person, that they trust, that they can trade dollars for crypto. But all that is to say, so once you get this Coinbase, application on your phone, or if you're using the website, you buy Bitcoin, it's custodied by Coinbase. So hypothetically, you're not really, the whole ethos of Bitcoin is such that it's peer-to-peer, internet native money. And it's, if I have my own wallet and I want to self-custody that, and I don't need to trust any sort of intermediary like a Citigroup or a Chase bank, it allows me to, I can get a wallet. There are tons and tons of wallets available, and this is something that's taking a long time to realize. For almost all of them are free. The hardware wallets are not, but there are different sort of levels of there are all sorts of wallets. There are hardware wallets. There are computers you can use as a wallet that are never connected to the internet, which are air gapped, so to speak. So there are different levels of operational security you can go through if you wanted to, and they're really fun. And I love reading and studying that stuff. I think it's fascinating. But ultimately, if you can remember, all of these are ultimately, when you spin up a wallet, oftentimes the way that they're actually sort of providing that security for you is that they might have a password that allows you to log in on a daily basis or whatever it is, a monthly basis. But the backup of that wallet is a very different model than everything that everybody's used to on the internet. There's no password recovery. There's no, let's call some guy who's going to unlock it for me and ask me my date of birth and my social security number. That's not how it works. It's going to be, you are entirely the owner of this asset because you are the owner of that wallet. And there are different wallets for different networks. Bitcoin wallets are not necessarily compatible with Ethereum, not necessarily compatible with Hedera, for example. Hedera is a very different technology than Ethereum. And so there are different wallets on each of these networks oftentimes, although some of them are identical experiences because Ethereum has been forked or copied many hundreds of times. And so many of the wallets that are used on most popular are really just Ethereum compatible and therefore compatible with all of the Ethereum forks that came afterwards. Whereas Hedera is a different technology. And so that wallet that is most popular on Ethereum, MetaMask, is not compatible with Hedera to begin with. Although that now that's not true because Hedera has made it such that MetaMask is compatible. So, but that was a work in progress. There are Hedera native wallets. Yeah, it's the biggest player, but it's a software wallet. It's not a hardware wallet. So when it comes to security, it's not necessarily the best. When you see a lot of these scams that people are going through, because these people are not really practicing good operational security, they're keeping a lot of their assets on this wallet that's native to their browser. They're leaving themselves it's a honey pot, so to speak. The bears just want the honey they're not going after the one bee. They're going after where all the bees are hanging out, right? Where the honey is. So,
and you can't like go to the police and be like, hey, somebody drained my MetaMask. The police are gonna say, dude, I don't know what you're talking about. So it's the digital version.
What the fuck are you talking about?
If you think of your digital wallet as a safe that's holding all this cash, but it's digital cash, somebody can come in, take your safe, and walk out with it, but there's no way to really track them down. And that's one of the scarier things. It's what gets a lot of people to not do it.
You literally can track them, though. You can literally watch the transactions in the blockchain. So you can watch them, but you can watch them helplessly. And that's kind of the point, is that you don't necessarily know. You're not able to tie back that name, that address, that token, that very long hash that is an address. You don't necessarily know who that is, right? I mean, if you were the CIA or some organization, and you have or you're some massive organization or government, there are ways to find out, I'm sure, by sort of going through an audit process and then demanding information from a centralized authority like Coinbase. But ultimately, at a high level, for you and me, we're not going to be able to see who it is that took our money, but we'll see where they're putting that, where they're sending it to. But all that is to say that with I've said all that is to say many times, but I really want to get to the idea that wallets themselves, when you self-custody them, there is this redundancy, this backup that is the most popular version of that backup process is a mnemonic phrase, and it's 12 or 24 words, and those are written down. What you should do from an operational security perspective is write them down, not copy and paste them into some sort of notepad on your computer, but write them down and ultimately make it such that that is kept in a safe place where it's not going to burn to the ground if your house burns down. Because if it does, and you have no redundancies of it, you lose everything. You don't call somebody and you don't send an email to support@Coinbase. If you're custodying it with Coinbase, sure, you're able to actually recover. There is some sort of, that's something that they're actively working on, although they're not FDIC insured. And so I would be very wary of that. But if you want to be your own custody of these things, you have to spin up your own wallet, which is very simple, but ultimately something to think about. There are many different wallets and hardware wallets. If you're like me and you're most interested in investing in Bitcoin and think of that as potentially a viable, something that might increase in value in the long term. For me, what I do is I buy these on Coinbase. I oftentimes might not buy them on Coinbase, but I'll onboard my dollars in Coinbase, trade them from dollars into stable coins on Coinbase, the app, and then put them into some sort of DeFi application so that I'm actually sort of playing with them on chain in real time. And then when I buy that Bitcoin over the course of time, I then transfer that to my hardware wallet, which is actually literally a piece of plastic that I have. And I have several redundancies of those phrases, those words, those 12 or 24 word phrases. And if you really wanted to, and there was some sort of crazy oppression that had happened, and I needed to travel somewhere, and I wanted to make it such that no one knew that I had that a certain amount of Bitcoin, I don't think it's very realistic for that scenario to play out. But there are a lot of very interesting movies that you can imagine this happening, And so, there's a lot of interesting stories at least, but you can at least, in a lot of places, this is a reality, right? For us, again, we're very, very privileged in an infinite number of ways. But if you are in a place like, there are so many different examples, but ultimately, if you are oppressed in some way and you need to flee, and you can remember those 12 words and you have no evidence of them anywhere else except for your memory of them, that allows for you to be truly sovereign. And that's incredibly powerful. And this is the first technology in the world that allows for you to do that. It's not like carrying gold around. Gold bugs are very quick to say this is not new. It is new. You're able to do it with just the shirt on your back. It's very, very new. So it's fascinating from that perspective. But wallets at a high level allow for you to be self-custody a lot of these assets. And I think really the Bitcoin is the one that I'm most interested in talking about. But centralized exchanges like Coinbase are different from DeFi, decentralized applications and dApps that exist on the blockchain specifically and allow for peer-to-peer transactions through Ethereum and a lot of these networks, Hedera. But yeah, the wallet component is very, very interesting. There are lots of different wallets. Some are Bitcoin native and only for Bitcoin. Some are Ethereum native and only for Ethereum. I think that in the long term, what we're really seeing is there are a lot of wallets, a lot of teams that are innovating on wallets because there's so much to be improved upon there, because it's impossible to indoctrinate a culture of people, hundreds of millions of people more, who are used to the forgot password button at the bottom of the screen on every application they interact with. Is extremely new. And I don't think that there's really going to be mass adoption until that is much more intuitive for people. And I don't necessarily know that there needs to be mass adoption. I'm not here to shill this and make it seem as though I need for this to succeed. It's not my intention. But ultimately, I think that the wallet space is something to keep an eye on. There is an organization, for example, that allows for you to spin up a wallet just by providing your email address. And that allows you to then self-custody it by each and every time you want to log in. It sends you an email. And not necessarily the most secure. I think that the way that they architected it themselves is at a very, very, very high level of security competence, but email is not necessarily the most secure option, just because your email itself can be hacked, and then ultimately your wallet is therefore vulnerable. But it's a spectrum, it's a spectrum. And if you're, Julian Assange on one end of the spectrum and you want to have sovereignty and the availability for your money to be your own and be your own bank, you're able to do that. And on the other end, I think that when it comes to larger adoption, there's going to have to be something that's much more intuitive, like email login. And then also there's a lot of really interesting things about these networks really sort of prioritizing recovery of assets, making that built into the technology itself, because intuitively people, like we're saying, they're very used to the forgot password button. They're too used to it. I think that, it's just gonna be impossible for anybody to get around that. To go from one end of the spectrum to the absolute opposite from with the technology makes it that adoption curve is going to be very slow, because it's counterintuitive to a lot of people.
Yeah, there's a big leap from going from an email account to having a 12 or 24 word seed phrase and then owning that, figuring out how to keep it safe. There's a bunch of different solutions, and we could potentially go into it. I mean, we could spend a lot of time on like salting a seed phrase, which means adding in words that aren't actually a part of it. And then you write it out that way. Even if somebody got access to it, they could try and type it in, but they wouldn't know which words are salt words that ruin it. So there's cool stuff you can do. And I personally was hesitant about it at the beginning, and I really like it now. And I have some cool solutions for keeping my seed phrases. And it's one of those things, if I was to get hit by a bus tomorrow, my partner could have my seed phrase and have access to all my assets, which is cool.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the last thing I'll say about it is the coolest part, really interesting. I retweeted it a couple of weeks ago. I think that the best place for this information, is physically, not digitally to begin with. And then there are varying levels of resilience within that category of physical sort of manifestation of the information of these words. And written down on a piece of paper is vulnerable to fire, obviously.
Yeah.
But stamping it into metal is much less vulnerable. And so you see a lot of people taking bolts, and then they make it so that they're able to stamp these different words into the different sides, just one by one, because they have like a letter press into the side. So a bolt is interesting. But ultimately, somebody had said that the best one is to have door hinges and do them on the inside of the door hinge, so you can't see it when you open it, and then you screw the hinge into the wall. And so that if you know where that is, and like you were saying, if you're hit by a bus, your partner can find it. You got to let them know. Otherwise, they're a crazy goose.
In your will, it just says like doorway to the bathroom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're right. Well, I thought that was a cool idea. Yeah.
Yeah, cool solution that only maybe some very high level hackers might try and figure out, but honestly, it's a pretty cool one. And they went through on that Twitter thread. I think if you just Google like seed phrase door hinge, it would pop up. They went through some cool solutions of like the type of metal you'd need, stuff like that. I love that shit. I don't own a house, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Put it on my apartment door, but yeah.
Yeah. For me, I have a copy here in my apartment with me, and it has some, it allows for there to be,
You're putting that on the internet. What's the address to your apartment?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I live in Astoria, Queens. Yeah, but ultimately, but then having redundancies of it. So if, that's not the only copy that I have. And that copy, it doesn't make sense for them to be in the same drawer.
Where are the other copies, and how can I get my hands on them?
I don't think anybody needs my secret. I have like 25 different wallets, right? So it's really interesting to create a mind map of, since 2016, maybe a little bit less than that, playing in DeFi, how many wallets do you have? It's fascinating. And so I have a mind map of all of these different wallets that I've used over the years. And I've actually have all the different relationships. It's a very interesting exercise from an operational security perspective, because that's your trail. There's no anonymity there. I assume that there's no anonymity. There are these addresses, and I think of those as being very, if anybody knows that those addresses are mine because I've shared it with somebody, or I tell somebody to send something, or because I have an ENS, Ethereum name service, and I've named it. I own scruffychuck.wallet. And so if you send anything, you can see the wallets that are associated with that, and then you can look back and see all the transactions I've made. And so that's that's interesting. It's an interesting little nuance that's different than what a lot of people assume, because they think this is all anonymous, and they think that Bitcoin allows for the dark web to exist. So yeah, I just want to talk about wallets. I think that's enough.
Yeah, nice, dude. Yeah, I think that was a good overview. So to wrap it up, we can do our hot takes of the week. This is a new segment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll go
do you
first.
Have it?
Yeah. If you're watching this on video, my hot take is co-working spaces are very cool. We're both remote guys. I work from home all day. I live in the same house that I work in. And I was finding myself pretty unmotivated and running into a lot of focus issues. And it's more than I would like to spend a month, but go to a co-working space, you have your own little setup, you got free coffee. I said my hot take is that it is worth the money.
Cool. I love it. Coffee too. You had mentioned that to me. I love that. I think that's probably the biggest selling point for me is the coffee.
I gotta drink $300 worth of coffee this month. That's so much coffee.
Yeah. I don't really have like a hot take right now, but one thing I learned this week that I was really stoked on is that there's usually free parking for motorcycles at airports. And so I went to Tennessee this week for something else I work on. Shout out wise-bar.com. But ultimately, I went to Tennessee for a conference, and we had a booth there. We were working on that, and I rode my motorcycle to LaGuardia Airport here in New York City, and there's free motorcycle parking, and it's awesome. It's really convenient. It's it's usually like $40 a day at least to park my truck at these parking lots, and then. Yeah, there's just a lot of logistical issues, and riding a motorcycle is awesome and obviously much more efficient and quicker way to get around. But yeah, I think that's probably the coolest thing I learned recently. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. There's like 8 little slots for motorcycles, and I brought my lock, and easy peasy. It was awesome.
I think the motorcycle pretty much pays for itself at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I went to the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, to buy it in the middle of nowhere, and so. And actually, this is interesting. Yeah, a different hot take is you can buy a motorcycle with Bitcoin. I bought a motorcycle with Bitcoin in 2021 from a guy in Jersey. I had a motorcycle. Yeah, I bought a motorcycle in 100% Bitcoin.
Craigslist has that feature, which is cool. Buy with Bitcoin or buy with crypto, which you can filter by and literally go and interact with people. It's a cool use case for it. And
it is. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, nice, dude.
Cool. Sweet, man. Awesome. Episode 3 wrapped it up.
That's a wrap up. Shout out to Josiah Soren, who we use his music every week. Check out his collection, Lo-Fi Leopards. And we will be back in 7 days.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Ciao, y'all.
Yeah, see ya.